Bridget, you already have a successful life. Chase needs our support right now. It is just a wedding. That is the 47-second voicemail my mother left while driving to Austin for my 22-year-old brother's Division III soccer championship. She delivered the news like she was canceling a dentist appointment, not erasing her presence from her only daughter's wedding day. My parents chose to watch a college benchwarmer play a weekend game over listening to my vows. They did not send a single text or make a single call after that. But what they did not know was that my grandfather had attached one strict condition to his entire $8.5 million estate. And the man holding that condition was about to walk through the chapel doors. Before I reveal what happened when the music stopped, if this kind of family betrayal hits close to home, take a second to hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment with your age and let me know if you have ever had to build your own family from scratch. You are tuning in to QT Told Stories. My name is Bridget Shepard. I am 30 years old. Now let me take you to the altar of a limestone chapel in Dallas, Texas. I did not stand there crying in my vintage lace gown. I am a botanical designer. My life is built on taking broken things and making them grow. So instead of letting my parents' absence leave a hole in the room, I turned it into an exhibition. In the very front row, where the parents of the bride should sit, I placed two vintage wooden chairs. I spent the morning weaving thick, thorny briar vines over the armrests and across the seats. The vines suffocated the wood. Right between the chairs, growing out of the harsh thorns, I placed a single, flawless, white orchid. It was the anatomy of a betrayal right there for 80 guests to see. Nobody had to ask where Richard and Diane Shepard were. The chairs told the whole story. I reached up and touched my left ear. I was wearing the heirloom pearl drop earrings my mother promised she would help me put on today. I put them on myself in a quiet bridal suite while staring at a mirror. My sister-in-law Maya stepped up behind me and gently adjusted the edge of my lace veil. She looked at the thorny chairs, then met my eyes. "Blood does not make a family, Bridget," she whispered. "The people who show up do." She was right. I turned my attention to Ethan. He stood across from me, a sharp financial advisor who knew the exact cost of every sacrifice I had ever made for my family. He reached out and squeezed my hands. His grip was steady. He was not pitying me. He was anchoring me. The string quartet faded into silence. The late afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The officiant cleared his throat and opened his leather-bound book. He spoke the traditional words, his voice echoing in the high ceilings. "If anyone here knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." It was a formality. No one ever speaks. But the moment a question hung in the air, a loud metallic click echoed from the back of the chapel. The heavy oak doors swung open, hitting the stone walls with a dull thud. The afternoon light poured in, outlining the silhouette of an older man holding a sealed leather briefcase. The heavy oak doors hit the stone walls with a dull thud. 80 guests turned their heads in unison. A collective gasp rippled through the wooden pews, breaking the sacred silence of the chapel. Sunlight flooded the entryway, casting a long, sharp shadow down the center aisle. Stepping into the light was Thomas Sterling. He was 72 years old, the senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm, and my late grandfather's most trusted confidant. He wore a pristine charcoal suit, his posture rigid, his silver hair neatly combed. In his right hand, he gripped a battered dark mahogany briefcase. His leather shoes clicked against the limestone tiles with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He was not rushing. He walked with the heavy, inevitable certainty of a man delivering fate. Whispers erupted among the guests. A few of the older Dallas socialites in the back rows recognized him immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that made the lace of my bodice tremble. I had not seen Mr. Sterling since Grandpa Harrison's funeral 2 years ago. A woman wearing a black headset rushed out from the side corridor. She was the venue coordinator hired to ensure every moment of this ceremony ran according to a strict schedule. She darted into the center aisle, holding up both hands to block his path. "Sir, you cannot interrupt this service," she hissed, keeping her voice low but frantic. "You need to step outside right now." Mr. Sterling did not break his stride. He merely paused, reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit, and produced a single folded sheet of thick ivory paper. He handed it to the coordinator. "I am not a disruptive guest," he stated, his voice a rich baritone that carried easily across the quiet chapel. "I am executing a mandate signed by a Texas probate judge. I suggest you step aside and allow the law to take its course." The coordinator scanned the document, her eyes widening. She swallowed hard, stepped back, and pressed her back against the nearest pew, rendering herself invisible. Mr. Sterling resumed his walk. Maya, standing just over my left shoulder, shifted her weight. I could hear the subtle rustle of her silk bridesmaid dress. She leaned in closer to me, her presence a fierce protective wall. Ethan tightened his grip on both my hands. He stepped slightly forward, placing his body half an inch between me and the approaching lawyer. Ethan was a man who lived by logic and numbers, but right now his jaw was clenched tight. He was bracing for an attack. Mr. Sterling reached the bottom of the altar steps and stopped. He looked at Ethan, noting the defensive posture, and offered a small, reassuring nod. "Relax, son," Mr. Sterling said softly. "I am not here to stop the wedding. I am here to secure it." He turned his gaze to me. His sharp blue eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "Hello, Bridget. You look exactly as your grandfather hoped you would. Strong." The mention of Grandpa Harrison sent a sharp ache through my chest. Grandpa was a titan in the Dallas real estate market. He built his fortune through sheer grit, living his final decades in a sprawling, majestic estate in the Highland Park Villas. But beyond his wealth, he was a man of intense, silent observation. While my parents treated our family like a theatrical production starring Chase, Grandpa sat in the audience and took meticulous notes. I remembered sitting in his quiet, cedar-lined study when I was 19. My parents had just canceled my college tuition payments to afford an elite private soccer coach for Chase. I was sobbing, wondering how I would pay for my botanical design courses. Grandpa did not offer empty comfort. He poured a cup of black coffee, handed me a pen, and told me that the hardest wood grows in the cruelest winters. He saw every lie my father told. He witnessed every time my mother praised Chase for breathing while ignoring my grueling 70-hour work weeks. He saw the rot in our family tree, and apparently he had spent his final days figuring out how to prune it. Mr. Sterling turned away from us and faced the officiant. He cleared his throat, commanding the attention of every single person in the room. "I apologize for the unorthodox timing," Mr. Sterling announced, raising his voice to ensure it reached the back rows. "However, the legal directive I am bound to execute carries a strict temporal constraint. It was explicitly drafted to be opened and enacted during this exact ceremony before the exchange of rings." He set the heavy mahogany briefcase down on a small wooden table meant for the unity candles. He kept his hand resting firmly on the handle. For the official legal record, Mr. Sterling continued, retrieving a small digital audio recorder from his pocket. He pressed a red button. "The date is October 12th. The time is 4:15 in the afternoon. We are gathered at the Trinity Limestone Chapel." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the guests until they landed on the front row. He stared directly at the 2 vintage chairs I had covered in thorny, invasive vines. "I require verbal confirmation from the presiding officiant," Mr. Sterling said. "Are Richard Shepard and Diane Shepard, the biological parents of the bride, physically present in this building?" The silence that followed was suffocating. 80 guests held their breath, The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. The officiant, a kind older man who had performed hundreds of weddings, looked thoroughly bewildered. He glanced at me, then at Ethan, and finally at the empty, overgrown chairs. "No," the officiant answered, his voice shaking slightly. "They are not present." Mr. Sterling nodded. He spoke clearly into the recorder. "Let the record show that Richard and Diane Shepard have failed to appear at the wedding of their daughter, Bridget Shepard." He clicked the recorder off and slid it back into his pocket. The air in the chapel felt electric. I was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable shiver radiating from my core. I had no idea what was happening. I thought Grandpa had left his entire fortune to my parents, as they had boasted for the last 2 years. They had already spent thousands in anticipated inheritance money, upgrading their cars, and funding Chase's endless string of failures. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," Bridget Mr. Sterling said, turning back to face me. "He understood human nature. He knew that wealth in the wrong hands is a weapon. He also knew that your parents were masters of creating illusions. They could fake apologies, they could fake affection, and they could easily fake a relationship to secure a payout." Mr. Sterling placed both hands on the brass locks of his briefcase. "That is why he drafted a final secret addendum to his will," Mr. Sterling explained. "This addendum remained entirely dormant. It was a lock that required a very specific key to turn. Your grandfather knew your parents prioritized your brother over you. He predicted that given the choice between an event for Chase and a milestone for you, they would abandon you. He structured this legal instrument to be activated solely by their physical absence today." The congregation murmured. A wealthy aunt in the third row let out a soft gasp of shock. Ethan squeezed my hand so hard my knuckles turned white. Maya let out a low, satisfied exhale, recognizing that justice was walking into the room. By choosing to attend a collegiate athletic event in Austin today, Mr. Sterling declared, his voice ringing with finality. "Richard and Diane Shepard have triggered the irrevocable execution of this addendum." He pushed the brass locks on the briefcase. They popped open with 2 sharp, echoing clicks. I stared at the dark leather, my mind racing. What had Grandpa done? What kind of trap had he set from beyond the grave? My parents thought they were punishing me today. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about my place in the family hierarchy. They had no idea they were walking blindly into a snare woven by the only man whose approval they desperately craved. Mr. Sterling lifted the lid of the briefcase. He did not pull out a standard stack of legal papers bound in blue covers. He reached inside and extracted 2 very distinct items. First, he pulled out a sleek, modern digital tablet, its screen dark and polished. Second, he withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope, tightly sealed with deep crimson wax. He placed the tablet on the altar, right next to the white orchid struggling to bloom. Then he held the wax-sealed envelope in his hands, tracing the emblem stamped into the center. "This," Mr. Sterling said softly, looking directly into my eyes, "is the true legacy of Harrison Shepard, and it is about to change the foundation of your entire life." Mr. Sterling placed his thumb under the thick crimson wax sealing the manila envelope. He pushed upward. The wax snapped with a sharp crack that echoed across the silent chapel. He slid a stack of heavy vellum papers out from the enclosure. The room was so quiet you could hear the rustle of the thick pages. He smoothed the documents over the surface of the wooden altar table. I stood frozen in my vintage lace gown. Ethan rested his palm against the small of my back to keep me steady. "The last will and testament of Harrison Shepard decrees the immediate distribution of his entire estate," Mr. Sterling read aloud. "The assets include the Highland Park Villas property, the varied stock portfolios, the commercial real estate holdings, and all liquid accounts. The total valuation sits at $8.5 million. A murmur swept through the pews. My parents had built their entire identity around the assumption of this exact wealth. They spent decades waiting for my grandfather to pass away, pre-spending money they treated as a guaranteed inheritance. My mother used to walk through high-end design showrooms in Dallas, pointing at Italian marble countertops and promising sales associates she would return soon to make the purchase. My father recently secured loans against a future he believed was written in stone to fund the extravagant lifestyle of my brother. Mr. Sterling raised his hand, gesturing for silence. The murmurs ceased instantly. The distribution of this $8.5 million estate, Mr. Sterling continued, was contingent upon a single physical requirement. Richard and Diane Shepard were required to be physically present at the Trinity Limestone Chapel on October 12th. They were required to witness the vows of their daughter, Bridget Shepard. My breath caught in my throat. Grandpa had structured his wealth as a mirror to reflect their true priorities. He wanted proof they could choose me over Chase for just one afternoon. Because Richard and Diane Shepard have failed this requirement, the primary directive is nullified, Mr. Sterling stated. The entirety of the funds and properties bypasses them. The estate transfers immediately into an irrevocable trust. The sole trustee and beneficiary of this trust is Bridget Shepard. The collective intake of breath from the wedding guests was audible. Ethan tightened his grip on my hand. I felt a cold wave of shock wash over my skin. All the money, all the properties, everything they had coveted now belonged to me. But Grandpa was a master of psychological strategy. He did not just want to punish them, he wanted to expose them. Mr. Sterling turned the page of the document. The addendum contains a secondary mandate, Mr. Sterling announced. We will refer to it as the Repentance Clause. For the next 6 months, the estate sits in a probationary freeze. During this window, Richard and Diane Shepard have one opportunity to reclaim 20% of the liquid assets and secure the deed to the Highland Park house. I stared at the lawyer, trying to process the complex trap my grandfather had engineered. To activate this reclamation, Mr. Sterling read, the parents must perform one documented act of genuine self-sacrifice for their daughter. This act must cost them something real, and it must be entirely devoid of any financial motivation or external gain. If the executor determines there is even a trace of manipulation or greed driving the gesture, the offer vanishes forever. It was a brilliant test, designed specifically for narcissists. Grandpa knew my parents were incapable of unselfish love. He gave them a rope and invited them to tangle themselves in it. Mr. Sterling folded the heavy vellum papers and tucked them back into the envelope. He stepped closer to me. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He gently placed it into the center of my palm. It was a tiny yellow daisy, pressed flat and preserved inside a thick disc of clear glass. I looked down at the flower, and hot tears finally spilled over my lashes. I was 7 years old again. I had tripped and fallen in the dirt behind the sprawling Highland Park estate, scraping both my knees to reach that specific daisy. My mother had scolded me for ruining my pristine white dress, swatting my dirty hands away in disgust. But Grandpa had knelt down in the soil, taken the crushed flower from my fingers, and put it in his own pocket. He told me that strong roots always require a little dirt. He saved it all these years. It was his message from beyond the grave, proving he always saw my true worth. Mr. Sterling bowed his head slightly, closed his mahogany briefcase, and stepped back into the center aisle. He took a seat in the second row. The heavy legal tension slowly dissolved, leaving behind a profound emotional clarity. The officiant cleared his throat, still visibly stunned by the multi-million-dollar revelation, and asked Ethan and me to join hands once more. Ethan looked down at me. His eyes were bright and unwavering. We exchanged our vows right there in front of the thorny, overgrown vintage chairs. The absence of my parents no longer felt like a deep wound. It felt like a necessary evacuation, clearing the space for the family I was choosing to build. We shared our first kiss as husband and wife, and the chapel erupted into genuine, soaring applause. The reception took place in a magnificent glass conservatory filled with cascading greenery and white blooms. It was a celebration entirely free of toxic energy. There were no passive comments from my mother criticizing the catering menu. There was no father demanding the bartender serve top-shelf liquor on my tab. Maya was radiant, dancing with the groomsmen, protecting my joy like a loyal sentinel. Ethan and I ate, laughed, and drank champagne under the Texas stars. Towards the end of the evening, Maya pulled me away from the crowded dance floor. We stood near a quiet corner of the conservatory, hidden behind a tall display of ferns. Her face was a strange mix of disbelief and dark amusement. She held up her glowing phone screen for me to see. It was my mother's social media page. A new photo had been uploaded just an hour ago. It was a selfie of my mother and father sitting on aluminum bleachers in Austin. They were holding plastic cups and wearing bright collegiate scarves. In the blurry background, Chase was sitting on the bench, not even playing on the field. The caption below the photo read, "Family First, supporting our golden boy on his big day." I stared at the glowing screen. The irony was heavy enough to sink a battleship. They were smiling in the Texas heat, oblivious to the reality that their decision to sit on those cheap bleachers had just cost them millions of dollars. They had no idea they had triggered a flawless trap engineered by the man whose wealth they coveted. Ethan wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me away from the digital ghost of my parents. We left the reception an hour later, under a shower of white rose petals, stepping into a waiting town car. Later that night, Ethan and I settled into our first-class seats on a flight to St. Lucia. The cabin was quiet, the interior lights dimmed for the late departure. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling a deep, abiding peace settle into my bones. I switched my phone off airplane mode for just a second to send a quick thank you message to Maya for her help. The moment the cellular signal connected, my phone screen froze. It vibrated once against my palm, then twice, then a continuous, relentless buzzing rattled against the plastic armrest. The notifications flooded the screen in an endless, frantic wave. Missed calls, voicemails, desperate text messages. Mr. Sterling had just delivered the official legal notices. The reality of their ruined future had finally landed in my parents' inbox. The Caribbean sun filtered through the sheer linen curtains of our cliffside villa. The rhythmic sound of the ocean crashing against the dark volcanic rocks below should have been a soothing lullaby. St. Lucia was designed to be a sanctuary, a paradise where Ethan and I could finally exhale after the tension of the wedding. I shifted against the crisp, white sheets, savoring the warmth of the morning. I reached blindly toward the mahogany nightstand to check the time. My fingers brushed the cold metal edge of my phone. The device was hot to the touch, buzzing with a frantic, unyielding vibration. I lifted the screen and my heart plummeted. 314 missed calls, 182 text messages. The digital notifications stacked over each other in a chaotic, overlapping tower of panic. The sender names alternated almost exclusively between my mother and my father. Thomas Sterling had executed his duty. He had delivered the official probate documents to their Dallas residence. The trap my grandfather engineered had sprung shut, and the resulting shockwave was currently vibrating in the palm of my hand. I tapped the voicemail icon, pressing the speaker to my ear. The first message belonged to Diane. Her tone was a masterful performance, a calculated mimicry of a wounded victim. She utilized a breathless, fragile pitch, the exact voice she deployed whenever she needed a department store manager to waive a return policy. "Bridget, honey, there has been a terrible error," she whimpered. "The lawyer sent us the most confusing legal binder. We were at the stadium, yes, but we planned to rush back and celebrate with you immediately after the trophy presentation. You know how much your brother needed our cheers. Please call the attorney. Tell him it is a misunderstanding. We are a family." I deleted the message before it finished playing. The next audio file featured my father. Richard did not deal in fragile theatrics. His voice carried the heavy, entitled cadence of a man who believed the world existed solely to serve his needs. "Bridget, pick up the phone the second you hear this," he ordered, his breath hitched with poorly concealed rage. "That old man lost his faculties at the end. We need to fix this clerical mistake before it damages my credit lines. That estate belongs to us. Do not make this difficult. Return our money." Ethan stepped out onto the sunlit terrace carrying 2 porcelain cups of dark local coffee. He set them down on a small woven table, took one look at my pale face, and gently pulled the phone from my grip. He did not shout. He did not curse their names. Ethan was a seasoned financial advisor. He understood that shouting was a waste of energy. He operated in the realm of hard facts and undeniable metrics. He retrieved his silver laptop from his leather travel bag, sat down facing the turquoise horizon, and began to type. Over the next 3 hours, while the tropical breeze moved through the palm fronds, Ethan constructed a fortress of undeniable data. He bypassed the emotional warfare and focused entirely on the numbers. He combed through years of my digital banking records, tax returns, and archived credit statements. He isolated every singular transfer, every supposed temporary loan, and every emergency bailout I had provided to Richard and Diane over the last decade. He organized the financial parasitism into neat, irrefutable columns. The cursor hovered over one specific transaction, originating 6 years prior: $15,000. I was 24 years old, working grueling 12-hour shifts at a wholesale flower market, tearing my hands apart on rose thorns to build my early client list. I lived in a cramped studio apartment with a leaking radiator. Chase had received an invitation to an exclusive, high-stakes soccer training clinic in Barcelona. My parents claimed their liquid funds were temporarily tied up in mutual funds. They pleaded with me to front the tuition, promising full repayment within 30 days. I emptied my entire meager savings account to send my brother to Europe. The repayment never arrived. When I cautiously asked about the debt months later, my father told me I was being petty for keeping a ledger within a family. That $15,000 was meant to be a down payment for my own botanical studio. Instead, it was surrendered to fund a vacation for a boy who spent the entire Spanish trip posting photos from nightclubs. Seeing that number digitized on the screen felt like a physical blow. It was not just currency. It was stolen time, stolen sleep, and stolen ambition. The spreadsheet continued downward, a chronological map of exploitation. There were multiple entries for thousands of dollars, covering luxury car repairs for Chase. There were charges for designer gowns Diane wore to country club charity dinners, billed directly to my credit card under the guise of a temporary oversight. Ethan highlighted the final cell at the bottom of the page, hitting the calculation function. The total sum was a staggering, heavy figure that represented a decade of my silent endurance. I looked at the finalized spreadsheet, then looked out at the endless expanse of the Caribbean Sea. I had a choice. I could answer the ringing phone, engage in a screaming match across international waters, and let their panic infect my sanctuary. Or I could close the door. I reached for the device, navigated deep into the settings menu, and engaged the total block feature for both of their numbers. I chose the quiet beauty of my honeymoon. I chose Ethan. Most importantly, I chose myself. I left the phone on the nightstand and walked out into the sun. The silence from my end acted like oxygen feeding a wildfire. For people accustomed to total control, being ignored is the ultimate insult. They could handle tears because tears meant they still held power over my emotions. Silence meant they had become irrelevant. Over the next 5 days, as Ethan and I swam in clear waters and explored hidden waterfalls, the digital barrage sitting in my blocked folder intensified. The nature of their messages shifted from frantic pleading to cold, undeniable hostility. They were beginning to understand the severe reality of the repentance clause. Grandpa had mandated they perform a selfless act to reclaim a fraction of the wealth, but my parents possessed no capacity for genuine sacrifice. They did not know how to be selfless. Instead of looking inward, they sought to bully their way out of a moral test. They needed me to break to call the lawyer and waive the conditions. My refusal to engage terrified them more than the will itself. On our final evening on the island, as we packed our suitcases, I checked the filtered voicemail inbox one last time to clear the storage space. There was a new, singular message from Richard. His tone had transformed entirely. It was no longer the voice of a man demanding his rightful property, nor was it the performative anger of a slighted father. It was the low, chilling register of a cornered predator, realizing the trap was inescapable. "You think you can hide on an island and steal our future, Bridget?" His voice echoed through the small speaker. "You are very wrong. Your return flight lands in Texas on Tuesday afternoon. Do not bother going to your house. We know your business schedule. We will be waiting inside the lobby of your floral design studio the exact moment you unlock the doors. We are going to settle this face-to-face, and you will sign those papers." The audio recording clicked off, leaving a heavy silence in the hotel room. The threat hung in the air, cold and precise. They were no longer treating me like a daughter, nor even like a disobedient child. They were treating me like an adversary, holding the keys to their survival. I looked at Ethan, who was already zipping his travel bag with determined efficiency. The honeymoon was over. The real war was waiting for us in Dallas. The flight back to Texas felt like a slow march toward a battlefield. Rain lashed against the windshield of our car as Ethan navigated the dark, slick highways leaving Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The skies over the city were bruised and weeping, mirroring the heavy dread settling in my chest. My father had promised to be waiting at the doors of my botanical design studio. I spent the entire journey mentally bracing for a screaming match, cataloging every boundary I needed to enforce. Ethan parked our vehicle down the street from the studio entrance, keeping the engine running just in case the situation required a swift exit. We walked through the steady downpour, sharing a single black umbrella. My studio was located in a renovated brick warehouse district, surrounded by wrought iron fencing and tall oak trees. I gripped the cold brass key in my pocket, my muscles tight, scanning the shadows from my parents' luxury sedan. The street was empty. The usual hum of the city was drowned out by the falling rain. As we approached the main glass doors, a solitary figure shifted in the darkness under the narrow awning. My breath caught. I stopped walking, signaling Ethan to halt. But the silhouette did not belong to a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit, nor was it a woman draped in expensive cashmere. The person huddled against the wet brick wall was young, soaked to the bone, and trembling uncontrollably. It was Chase. The golden boy of the Shepherd family looked entirely unrecognizable. His designer athletic jacket was stained and clinging to his shivering frame. His hair, usually styled with effortless precision, was plastered flat against his forehead. He hugged his knees to his chest, looking like a stray animal seeking shelter from a storm. There was no trace of the arrogant college athlete who demanded financial bailouts to fund his lavish weekends. This was a broken boy running from something terrifying. He looked up as our footsteps echoed on the wet pavement. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and frantic. "Bridget," he whispered, his teeth chattering so hard the syllables broke apart. "Please, let me inside." I unlocked the heavy glass door, pushing it open. He stumbled over the threshold, bringing the smell of damp asphalt and fear into my sanctuary. I flipped a switch, bathing the studio in warm golden light. The space was filled with the earthy scent of damp soil, crushed eucalyptus, and blooming jasmine. Towering ferns and intricate orchid arrangements lined the long wooden workbenches. Chase stood in the center of the room, dripping rainwater onto the polished concrete floor, staring at the vibrant life surrounding him, as if he had stepped onto an alien planet. Ethan locked the door behind us, standing near the entrance with his arms crossed. He did not trust my brother, and I could not blame him. "What are you doing here, Chase?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. "Mom and Dad said they were coming here tonight. They do not know I am here, he answered, wrapping his arms around his own torso. They think I am back in my dorm in Austin. They think I am celebrating the end of the season. A bitter laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it. Celebrating the championship, they sacrificed my wedding to watch. Chase flinched. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. That is just it, Bridge. There was no championship for me. I did not play a single minute of that game. I have not played in 6 months. The silence in the studio grew dense. I stared at him, trying to process the confession. My parents had abandoned my wedding day to sit on aluminum bleachers and watch a game my brother was not even participating in. The coach benched me in April, Chase continued, his voice cracking. My grades tanked. I started skipping practices. I hated it. I hated every single second of being on that field. I never wanted to play college soccer. I only did it because Dad paraded me around his country club like a prized racehorse, and Mom needed a reason to buy customized stadium gear. I was just a prop for their perfect social image. He paced the length of a nearby workbench, his wet sneakers squeaking against the concrete. I tried to tell them I wanted to quit, he said, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. I tried to explain that I was suffocating, but Dad told me I was being ungrateful. He said I was an investment, and investments paid dividends. So I found a different way out. I decided to make myself so toxic that the athletic department would have to cut me. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. How did you do that, Chase? He stopped pacing. He leaned heavily against the wooden table, dropping his head. I started placing bets, he whispered. I found a guy connected to an offshore syndicate. I bet on our own games. I bet on rival teams. I just wanted to get caught and get expelled. But I did not get caught by the school. I just kept losing. I lost so much, Bridget. I owe them $40,000, and they are not the kind of people who send polite collection letters. They know where I live. They know where our parents live. The magnitude of his disaster settled over the room. $40,000 in illegal gambling debt. My parents were furious over losing an inheritance, unaware that their prize son was drowning in a dangerous, volatile underworld. They had funded his facade, and he had burned it down just to escape their expectations. Chase looked up, scanning the lush, thriving plants filling my studio. His gaze lingered on a sprawling pothos vine climbing a moss pole, its leaves wild and reaching toward the skylight. You always had it so hard, Bridge, he said softly, a tear finally spilling over his cheek and mixing with the rain on his face. They ignored you. They criticized you. They made you pay your own way. You got the hard soil, but at least you got to grow. At least you became something real. They just put me in a plastic box and watered me with their own narcissism until my roots rotted out. His words struck a deep, resonant chord within my chest. He was not a villain. He was a casualty of the exact same system that tried to crush me. He was a victim of their toxic love, molded into a shape he despised until he shattered under the pressure. Please, Bridget, he begged, stepping toward me with his hands clasped together. I know you have the trust fund now. I know you control Grandpa's money. If you can just write a check, I swear I will disappear. I will get a job. I will pay you back every cent. I just need to survive this week. A profound moral dilemma paralyzed me. I had the power to save him. One signature on a bank transfer could wipe his slate clean, protecting him from men who broke bones to collect their dues. It was the instinct of an older sister to shield her younger sibling from harm, but I also knew the cost of a bailout. Rescuing him now meant enabling the exact cycle of financial dependency our grandfather had engineered his entire estate to destroy. If I paid his debts, I would just be building him a new, more expensive plastic box. I had to choose between being his savior or forcing him to face the brutal reality of his actions, an experience that might finally teach him how to survive in the hard soil. Before I could formulate an answer, a harsh, buzzing sound shattered the quiet intimacy of the room. Chase jumped, his eyes darting toward his wet jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated the dim space, displaying a restricted number. The device vibrated relentlessly against his trembling palm. He stared at the glowing screen, his face draining of whatever color remained. "They are tracking my location," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing. "They know I am here." A sudden flash of intense, blinding light flooded the studio. Twin beams of halogen headlights sliced through the heavy rain outside, sweeping across the tall glass windows and casting long, menacing shadows of the ferns against the brick walls. A large vehicle had just turned into the narrow alleyway leading directly to my entrance. The heavy crunch of tires rolling over wet gravel signaled an arrival. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Chase and the glass door, his stance wide and defensive. I held my breath, waiting to see if violent debt collectors were about to shatter the glass to claim what they were owed. But the vehicle that parked under the street lamp was not a dark, unmarked sedan. It was a silver luxury SUV. The driver's side door swung open, and my father stepped out into the pouring rain. My mother emerged from the passenger side, pulling a designer coat tight against the storm. The ambush had arrived. The heavy glass door rattled against its metal frame before swinging open. Wind and rain swept into the studio, extinguishing the warm, earthy scent of damp soil and blooming jasmine. Richard strode in first, shaking water from his designer trench coat. Diane followed closely, her heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. They brought a wave of entitlement into the room, disrupting the fragile peace of my sanctuary. Ethan shifted his stance, maintaining his solid block between the entrance and Chase. Two of my late-shift event coordinators, Sarah and Liam, paused their work dismantling a tall floral arch in the back corner. They exchanged wide-eyed glances, lowering their pruning shears. The private ambush had instantly transformed into a public spectacle. Richard spotted me standing near the center workbench. His face hardened into a mask of rigid authority. He did not ask how my honeymoon was. He did not acknowledge the wedding or offer a late apology. He marched forward, his gaze locked intensely on my face. "We told you to pick up the phone, Bridget," he demanded, his voice booming through the open warehouse space and echoing off the high ceilings. "You think you can play games with our livelihood? You think you can steal our future and hide on an island?" Diane stepped out from behind his shadow. She took one look at the audience consisting of Ethan, my two employees, and me, and she initiated her performance. Tears welled in her eyes with practiced speed. Her lower lip trembled, perfecting the image of a wounded, desperate mother. "How could you do this to us?" Diane sobbed, clutching the lapels of her wet coat against her chest. "Your grandfather was sick. He was senile at the end. Everyone knew his mind was slipping. You spent all those hours alone with him in his study, whispering poison into his ear, turning him against his own children just to take what rightfully belongs to us." I stood frozen, listening to her rewrite history with seamless ease. Grandpa possessed a mind sharper than a steel trap until the very minute his heart stopped beating. He managed his own stock portfolios and read dense legal contracts every morning. She was projecting her own manipulative nature onto me, attempting to paint herself as a victim of elder abuse in front of my staff to shame me into submission. I looked at my mother, noting the lack of genuine sorrow in her eyes. The coldness inside me solidified into something unbreakable. "Grandpa was not senile, Mom," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "He just finally wrote down exactly what he saw." Before Diane could launch into another round of fabricated weeping, the studio door opened a second time. Maya stepped inside, folding a black umbrella. She had driven straight from her own downtown law office to meet us, anticipating the impending storm. She wore a tailored crimson pantsuit, her posture radiating an undeniable commanding authority. She assessed the room in a fraction of a second. She noted the crying mother, the furious father, the terrified brother hiding in the shadows, and me standing my ground. Maya walked smoothly across the concrete floor. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her presence commanded the space, drawing every ounce of attention. She stepped flawlessly between me and Diane, creating an impenetrable human shield. "You are trespassing," Maya stated, her tone smooth and lethal. "This is a private business, and your daughter does not owe you a conversation." Diane recoiled, her fake tears evaporating into genuine indignation. "This is a family matter," she snapped. "Keep your mouth shut and stay out of it." "I am her family," Maya countered, not moving an inch backward. "I was there on her wedding day. I held her veil. I watched her walk down an aisle toward an altar featuring 2 vintage wooden chairs covered in thick, thorny vines. Those chairs represented the parents who could not be bothered to show up. You lost the right to demand anything from her the moment you chose aluminum bleachers over her vows." Richard stepped forward, pointing a finger squarely at Maya. "Listen here. You have no idea what you are talking about. We had a prior family obligation. We were supporting our son." Maya smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the smile of a chess player announcing checkmate. She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thin, square object. She turned it over and held it out toward my mother. It was a high-resolution printout, secured inside a simple black frame. I recognized the image immediately. It was the selfie Diane had posted on social media during my wedding reception. My parents were smiling brightly in the Austin Stadium, wearing their collegiate scarves. The printed caption read, "Family first, supporting our golden boy." Maya pressed the wooden frame directly into Diane's hands. My mother stared down at her own grinning face, the color rapidly draining from her cheeks. The physical proof of her betrayal rested heavy in her palms. "You made your choice," Maya told her, her voice ringing with cold finality. "Now, live in it." The realization that intimidation held zero power here crashed into my father. He could not bully Ethan, he could not silence Maya, and he could no longer control me. His face flushed a deep, mottled purple. He scanned the room, desperate to reclaim some fragment of dominance. His eyes landed on the dark corner where Chase was standing. My brother was still shivering, his clothes soaked from the rain, his eyes darting toward the street outside, where the bookies were presumably still tracking his phone. Richard did not notice the fear radiating from his son. He only saw a possession he still commanded. He saw a trophy he could take with him. "Get your coat, Chase," Richard barked, marching toward the shadows and grabbing my brother by the upper arm. "We are leaving. I will not stand here and be insulted by ungrateful children." Chase let out a soft whimper, stumbling forward as Richard yanked him toward the door. His wet sneakers squeaked against the concrete. My father treated him like a piece of expensive luggage, dragging him away from the only person who actually knew the danger he was in. His grip was tight, his knuckles white with frustration. Chase looked back at me over his shoulder, his expression pleading, begging me silently to intervene. I remained still. I could not save him tonight without breaking my own boundaries. Rescuing him meant paying the debt, and paying the debt meant surrendering to the exact financial cycle Grandpa wanted to destroy. Ethan moved to the front entrance, holding the heavy glass door open to hasten their departure. The rain continued to pour in sheets, washing over the pavement outside. Diane walked out first, clutching the framed photograph like a toxic artifact, her head bowed against the wind. Richard shoved Chase out into the storm ahead of him. Before crossing the threshold, my father paused. He turned back to face me one last time. The fury in his eyes had hardened into something cold and deeply calculated. He reached inside his damp trench coat, retrieved a thick, folded document sealed in a pristine white envelope, and tossed it onto my receptionist desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud against the reclaimed wood, sliding slightly on the polished surface. "We are not begging you for anything." "Bridget Richard," said his voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "See you in court." He stepped out into the rain, and Ethan let the glass door click shut, sealing the studio in quiet tension. The sound of their luxury SUV engine roared to life, tires spinning on the wet gravel as they sped away into the night. I walked over to the front desk and picked up the damp envelope. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out the legal filing. The stiff paper felt heavy in my hands. It was a formal notice of intent to sue the estate. My parents were officially taking me to a Texas probate judge, seeking to invalidate the entire will on the grounds of undue influence. They wanted to prove I had manipulated an old man into rewriting his legacy. But challenging Grandpa's ironclad directives meant opening up a decade of their own financial secrets to the legal system. As I stared at the dense legal jargon printed on the page, I knew the impending battle was about to unearth ghosts they thought they had buried forever. The legal document my father threw on the reception desk was not a mere empty threat. It was a formal declaration of war. By Tuesday morning, the official summons arrived via a county process server. Richard and Diane had retained the services of a notorious downtown litigator, a man famous throughout Dallas for tearing apart affluent families in probate court. His firm specialized in contesting wills, utilizing ruthless tactics to freeze assets and drain trusts through endless litigation. They were claiming undue influence, arguing I had preyed upon a vulnerable, declining patriarch to rewrite his legacy. I sat in the polished mahogany boardroom of Thomas Sterling's law office, staring at the thick stack of legal filings. The air conditioning hummed, keeping the space crisp and sterile. My hands shook slightly as I traced the embossed seal on the summons. Ethan sat beside me, reviewing the extensive financial disclosures my parents demanded. I felt a rising tide of anxiety. Fighting a protracted legal battle could take years. It would drain my energy, suffocate my growing botanical business, and drag my grandfather's honorable name through the mud of public record. Mr. Sterling walked into the room carrying 2 cups of herbal tea. He did not look like a lawyer facing a high-stakes lawsuit. He looked remarkably serene. He took a seat across from us, placing the porcelain cups on the table. He glanced at the hostile legal summons, smiled a genuine, relaxed smile, and slid the paperwork to the edge of the desk as if it were junk mail. Then he reached into his leather briefcase, the same bag he had carried down the chapel aisle. He pulled out the sleek digital tablet he had presented at the altar. It was secured inside a matte black protective case. Your grandfather anticipated this exact maneuver. Bridget, Mr. Sterling, said, his voice calm and steady. He knew Richard would hire a shark. He knew Diane would play the victim. Harrison Shepard built a real estate empire during the Texas oil boom by reading his opponents 3 steps ahead. He applied that same strategy to his own heirs. Mr. Sterling slid the device across the polished wood. This is your grandfather's true testament. It is highly encrypted, requiring your biometric scan to unlock. I placed my thumb on the digital sensor. The screen blinked green, opening a hidden directory. It was not a folder of financial spreadsheets or stock portfolios. It was a comprehensive video diary. I tapped the first thumbnail. The screen filled with the image of Grandpa Harrison sitting in his cedar-lined study. He looked sharp, vibrant, and entirely lucid. The date stamp indicated the recording was made 3 years prior to his passing. If you are watching this, my dear Bridget, Grandpa's voice filled the quiet boardroom. It means my heart has stopped, and your parents have started their predictable performance. His gaze pierced through the digital lens. He did not speak about real estate or dividends. He analyzed the deep structural rot within our family tree. He documented his observations as a silent witness to their cruelty. People believe I sat in this house, isolated from the world, the recording continued. But silence is the greatest tool for gathering truth. The video transitioned. It was no longer a simple monologue. Grandpa had digitized old home security footage. The scene shifted to a grainy black and white angle of his study from 10 years ago. I recognized my father younger, but carrying the same entitled posture, standing behind Grandpa's heavy oak desk. Richard was rifling through a stack of private banking documents. My father held a specific ledger, the custodial account established for my university tuition. Grandpa's voiceover returned, cold and clinical. Watch your father, Bridget. Watch him forge my signature to authorize a withdrawal from your education fund to cover a failed speculative stock trade. He stole your tuition, blamed the market crash, and then watched you work night shifts at the floral wholesale market to survive. The breath rushed out of my lungs. For a decade, I believed the lie that my college fund was wiped out by a bad mutual fund manager. I spent my early 20s exhausted, nursing bleeding fingers from thorns, believing it was just bad luck. My father had stolen my foundation to cover his own gambling in the stock market, while simultaneously parading Chase through expensive soccer training camps. The level of betrayal sickened me. The video flickered, returning to Grandpa's face. He leaned closer to the camera lens. "They will try to tell a judge that I lost my mind," Grandpa stated, a fierce glint in his eye. "They will claim you manipulated a sick old man, but these recordings prove my mental acuity is flawless. More importantly, they provide a documented timeline of Richard and Diane committing financial elder abuse. They siphoned funds. They lied about assets." He paused, his expression softening into a look of profound sorrow. "I created the repentance clause for a reason, my brave girl. I knew they would sue you. I wanted you to watch them fight for the money, to witness their greed laid bare, so you would never second-guess locking them out of your heart." Mr. Sterling paused the video. "There are over 40 hours of recordings on this drive," the lawyer explained. Harrison detailed every stolen dollar, every forged check, and every manipulated tax form. If Richard's attorney brings this lawsuit before a probate judge, we will enter this tablet into evidence. The resulting exposure will not just dismiss their claim, it will trigger a criminal investigation into your father for fraud. The heavy weight of dread that had been crushing my chest instantly evaporated. The lawsuit was not a threat. It was a loaded trap my parents were pointing at themselves. While Ethan and I secured the digital evidence, another fracture appeared in the Shepard family facade. Since the disastrous night at the botanical studio, Chase had vanished. His phone routed straight to voicemail. His social media accounts were deactivated. My mother sent me frantic, demanding emails, accusing me of driving her son away. But the truth was far more sinister. Chase had gone off the grid to escape the underground bookies hunting him for the $40,000 sports betting debt. His sudden disappearance left a vacuum of tension. The loan sharks knew where Richard and Diane lived, and without the golden boy there to protect, the parents were sitting in a very exposed, dangerous position. We returned to my small rented bungalow later that afternoon, carrying the invulnerable black box. I felt a profound sense of shifting momentum. We held the legal high ground. As Ethan unlocked our front door, he checked the small metal mailbox bolted to the porch railing. He pulled out a thick envelope bearing the official seal of a prominent Texas commercial bank. It was marked with bright red priority lettering, requiring a signature upon receipt. I tore open the seal, unfolding the heavy parchment inside. It was a formal transfer of deeds notice routed directly from Grandpa Harrison's primary holdings account. I scanned the dense paragraphs, my eyes catching on familiar addresses. The document outlined the transfer of the sprawling Highland Park estate. I always assumed my parents owned their opulent home. They boasted about their property taxes, hosted lavish garden parties, and treated the manicured grounds as their sovereign kingdom. But as I read the final paragraph, the true genius of my grandfather's long game revealed itself. Richard and Diane Shepard did not own the Highland Park Villas estate. Years ago, when my father faced a secret bankruptcy, Grandpa Harrison quietly bought the underlying mortgage to prevent foreclosure. He placed the deed under a shell corporation, which was now dissolved and absorbed into my irrevocable trust. My parents were not wealthy property owners. They were merely tenants, and as the sole trustee of the estate, I was now legally their landlord. The power dynamic did not just shift, it inverted entirely. The certified letter rested on my kitchen counter, its heavy parchment illuminated by the warm glow of the pendant lights. I stared at the bold, dark ink detailing the transfer of deeds. For my entire life, the Highland Park Villas estate stood as the ultimate symbol of the Shepherd family prestige. It was a sprawling property featuring manicured azalea gardens, a sweeping circular driveway, and towering marble columns. My parents hosted lavish charity dinners on that lawn. They posed for local magazine spreads in the grand foyer. They walked through the neighborhood with the quiet, unquestioned arrogance of true Texas royalty. The document sitting in front of me dismantled that illusion with ruthless precision. My parents were not wealthy landowners. They were ordinary tenants living on borrowed time. I picked up my phone and dialed Thomas Sterling. He answered on the second ring, his tone indicating he had been expecting my call. I read the parcel tracking number aloud and asked him to explain the mechanics of the Shell Corporation. "Your father faced severe financial ruin a decade ago," Mr. Sterling explained, his voice calm and methodical. "He over-leveraged his stock positions and faced imminent foreclosure. Harrison stepped in to protect the family name. He purchased the underlying mortgage in cash, utilizing an anonymous corporate entity to spare Richard the public humiliation. The agreement required your parents to pay a strict monthly lease directly to the trust to maintain their residency." A cold realization washed over me. Grandpa had essentially become their landlord to save them from the streets. But he kept the arrangement secret, allowing my father to maintain his fragile, inflated ego. "There is a secondary issue," Bridget the lawyer continued, the steady rhythm of his words slowing down. "Richard and Diane have not submitted a lease payment in 6 months. They are in severe default. I suspect they stopped paying the moment your grandfather entered hospice care, assuming they would inherit the property outright and erase the debt." I looked at Ethan, who was reading over my shoulder. The outstanding balance was staggering. They owed the estate tens of thousands of dollars in back rent. Because the Shell Corporation had dissolved and transferred its assets directly into my name, the debt now belonged to me. I held the literal roof over their heads. The power dynamic did not merely shift, it inverted with blinding speed. For 30 years, my parents dictated my worth based on what I could provide for them. They demanded obedience, weaponized their approval, and discarded me when I required support. Now their survival rested entirely in my hands. A heavy, suffocating wave of guilt crashed into my chest. I walked away from the kitchen island, pacing the length of my small living room. I was a botanical designer. My entire profession revolved around nurturing fragile things, providing sunlight, and encouraging growth. The idea of wielding a legal weapon to threaten my own parents with homelessness felt toxic. It felt like I was absorbing their cruelty and turning it back on them. "I cannot evict them," I whispered, staring blindly at a row of potted ferns lining the windowsill. "I know what they did to my college fund. I know they skipped the wedding. But putting an eviction notice on their door crosses a line. It makes me exactly like them." Ethan stepped away from the counter. He closed the distance between us, placing his hands firmly on my shoulders. Ethan grew up in a working-class neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a diner to keep the electricity running. He built his financial advisory firm on strict principles of accountability and hard work. He understood the sharp difference between genuine hardship and entitled exploitation. "You are confusing boundaries with punishment," Ethan said softly, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Holding them accountable for a legal debt is not an act of malice. It is an act of reality. They have spent a decade living in a mansion funded by stolen tuition money and your grandfather's charity while simultaneously treating you like a second-class citizen." He brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his touch grounding me in the present moment. "Enabling abusers is not a virtue, Bridget. Shielding them from the consequences of their own actions will not heal your family. It will only teach them that they can continue to hurt you without paying a price." His words sliced through the dense fog of my guilt. He was right. Every time I absorbed their blows in silence, I reinforced their delusion that I was expendable. Grandpa Harrison did not leave me this estate so I could continue funding their toxic masquerade. He left me the keys so I could finally lock the door. I turned back to my phone. Mr. Sterling was still waiting on the line. Draft the formal demand for the outstanding rent. I instructed my voice finding a new, unshakable center. Send it via courier tomorrow morning. Give them the standard 30 days to cure the default. The lawyer expressed his quiet approval, promising the paperwork would be flawless. The following afternoon, I sat in my studio trimming the stems of white hydrangeas for a weekend bridal shower. The rain had cleared, leaving the Dallas sky a brilliant, piercing blue. I knew the courier had delivered the demand notice to the Highland Park estate at noon. I spent hours bracing for the inevitable explosion. I expected my father to arrive unannounced, shouting threats of legal retaliation. I expected my mother to launch a smear campaign across her social networks. Instead, at 3 o'clock, the landline on my reception desk began to ring. It was not a restricted number. The caller ID displayed the familiar digits of my parents' home phone. I set down my pruning shears, wiped my hands on my canvas apron, and lifted the receiver. "Bridget, sweetheart," Diane purred into the speaker. The psychological whiplash nearly knocked me off balance. Her tone was dripping with artificial honey. She sounded vibrant, airy, and sickeningly sweet. It was the exact voice she used when addressing wealthy donors at country club fundraisers. There was no trace of the vicious woman who had cried fake tears in this very room just days prior. "Hello, Mom," I replied, keeping my guard raised high. "I am so glad I caught you," she continued, ignoring the coldness in my greeting. "I was just looking at the calendar, and I realized how much time has slipped away. We have been so disconnected lately. I want to fix that." I stared at the receiver, stunned by her audacity. She was behaving as if the lawsuit, the skipped wedding, the forged tuition funds, and the demand for tens of thousands in back rent did not exist. She was erasing reality, hoping I would follow her into the delusion. "The Silver Magnolia Charity Gala is this Saturday evening," Diane announced, her voice pitching upward with feigned excitement. "Our country club is hosting the event. I know you usually provide the floral arrangements, but I want you to attend as my personal guest this year. I already secured a seat for you at our primary table." The Silver Magnolia Gala was the crown jewel of the Dallas social season. It was an exclusive gathering of the most influential real estate developers, bankers, and politicians in Texas. My parents relied on this specific event to secure loans and maintain their elite status. "It is time we put all this silly paperwork behind us," Diane added, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "We are family. We should be seen together, smiling and united. It will be a wonderful opportunity to publicly mend fences. Say you will come, darling." The trap was so glaringly obvious, it almost felt insulting. She did not want to mend fences. The 30-day eviction notice had terrified her. She knew they lacked the funds to pay the debt, and she knew the impending lawsuit was a losing battle against Grandpa's video diaries. Diane was staging a public ambush. She intended to seat me in a ballroom surrounded by hundreds of prominent Dallas elites. She planned to leverage the heavy, suffocating weight of high society expectations to corner me. She would play the role of the loving, forgiving mother in front of her peers, creating a scenario where any refusal on my part would make me look like an ungrateful, hysterical daughter. She wanted to use public shame to force me into signing a waiver for the rent and the estate. She thought I would shrink under the bright lights of the country club. She thought I would surrender my leverage to avoid a scene. I looked around my thriving botanical studio, breathing in the scent of damp earth and fresh blooms. I was no longer the frightened girl crying over a stolen college fund. I owned the ground she walked on. "I will be there, Mom," I said, allowing a thin, sharp smile to form on my lips. "I think a public reunion is exactly what this family needs." I placed the receiver back onto its cradle. Diane believed she was setting the stage for my humiliation. She had no idea she had just provided me with the perfect venue to expose the roots of her betrayal. The lawsuit dissolved the exact moment Thomas Sterling submitted a formal notice regarding the encrypted video diaries to the opposing legal counsel. The infamous downtown litigator, a man known for dragging out probate battles for years, reviewed a single hour of my grandfather's recorded testimony. He immediately withdrew his representation. My parents were left standing on a collapsing foundation, with no legal advocate willing to take their case. The 6-month window designated by the repentance clause was rapidly shrinking. They had mere weeks left to perform an authentic act of self-sacrifice to secure 20% of the estate. But genuine sacrifice requires a soul capable of empathy, a trait neither Richard nor Diane possessed. So they attempted to manufacture it. The phone call arrived on a Thursday morning. My father sounded frantic. His voice cracked as he delivered the terrifying news. Diane had collapsed in the foyer of the Highland Park house. He claimed she was rushing to the emergency room at a private medical center in North Dallas. He begged me to hurry, painting a picture of a devoted husband watching his wife slip away. I grabbed my car keys, my heart performing a traitorous leap. Despite the layers of betrayal, the instinct to protect a parent is deeply wired into human biology. A child will always flinch when they hear their mother is in danger. I reached the studio door handle when my phone buzzed with an incoming text message from an unknown number. "Do not fall for it," the message read. "It is a setup. Mom paid a private concierge doctor to admit her for exhaustion. She is planning to refuse an expensive diagnostic procedure and tell you she is doing it to save your inheritance. The loan sharks found the house, Bridget. Dad is terrified. Do not sign anything." The sender was Chase. My brother was currently bouncing between cheap motels on the outskirts of the city, hiding from the men he owed $40,000. His conscience had finally outgrown his fear. He blew the whistle on their theatrical production. The rush of adrenaline in my veins turned into ice. My parents were utilizing the illusion of a terminal illness to secure a payout. I drove to the medical center, stopping briefly at my botanical greenhouse. I selected a very specific item for my visit. The hospital was an exclusive facility catering to affluent Dallas residents, featuring marble floors, soft instrumental music, and valet parking. It felt more like a spa than a place of healing. I bypassed the front desk, navigated to the VIP recovery wing, and located room 412. I pushed open the heavy wooden door without knocking. The scene inside did not resemble a medical crisis. It resembled a luxury hotel vacation. Diane was sitting upright in a plush adjustable bed, wearing a silk robe instead of a standard hospital gown. Her complexion was glowing, her makeup flawlessly applied. She was holding a laminated menu, debating between the pan-seared salmon and the filet mignon. Richard stood near the large bay window, arguing with a billing administrator over a declined transaction. My father was trying to secure a premium room upgrade using a platinum credit card that had already reached its maximum limit. Their financial ruin was catching up to their lavish lifestyle. He raised his voice, demanding the hospital respect his status, unaware that his status no longer existed. Diane looked up, startled by my sudden entry. She scrambled to drop the room service menu and adopt a weak, fragile posture. She slumped against the pillows, letting out a hollow cough. She reached out a trembling hand toward me. "Bridget," she whispered, forcing a raspy, delicate tone. "You came to see me. I told the doctors I do not want the cardiac imaging. It costs too much money out of pocket. I cannot let you spend your grandfather's trust on my health. I would rather suffer than take from your future." It was a rehearsed monologue. She pitched her voice perfectly to fulfill the legal requirements of the repentance clause. She was performing her fake sacrifice, expecting me to weep by her bedside and call Thomas Sterling to release the funds in a burst of emotional gratitude. I did not rush to her side. I did not shed a single tear. I walked slowly across the pristine room, carrying a small terracotta pot in my hands. Inside the pot was a maidenhair fern I had intentionally neglected for weeks. Its fronds were brown, shriveled, and beyond any hope of revival. It was dead at the roots, ruined by a lack of nurturing and an absence of light. I set the withered plant gently onto the sleek bedside table, right next to her silver water pitcher. "Chase says hello," I stated, my voice echoing in the sterile room. "He also mentioned you prefer the salmon." The fake frailty vanished from my mother's face. Her jaw dropped, her hand froze in midair. Richard turned away from the billing administrator, his face draining of color. The realization hit them simultaneously. The curtain had fallen on their performance. The manipulation had failed, and there was no backup plan. They had squandered their single opportunity to pass the moral test left by my grandfather. I turned around and walked out of the hospital suite, leaving them in a suffocating, heavy silence. The expiration date of the repentance clause loomed just days away. Panic is a dangerous catalyst. It strips away logic and breeds desperate actions. The men Chase owed money to were losing patience. Dark-tinted vehicles began idling near the wrought iron gates of the Highland Park estate at all hours of the night. Strangers walked up the circular driveway, leaving threatening notes on the front door. Intimidation tactics escalated rapidly. My parents were trapped in a mansion they did not own, surrounded by predators they could not pay off. Richard realized the inheritance was permanently out of reach. He needed liquid cash immediately to save his own life and maintain his fragile social standing. The pressure broke whatever moral compass he had left. On a Tuesday afternoon, a courier delivered a routine stack of business mail to my botanical studio. Ethan sat at the front reception desk, sorting through the envelopes, while I designed a centerpiece for a corporate event. He paused, holding a thick folder originating from a predatory private lending firm. He opened the seal and scanned the enclosed paperwork. His expression darkened into pure disbelief. Ethan was a man who analyzed risk for a living, but the document in his hands defied all rational boundaries. He stood up and walked over to my workstation, laying the papers flat across the wood. Richard had crossed a fatal line. In a blind panic to secure capital, my father had submitted an application for a substantial high-interest personal loan using the Highland Park estate as collateral. But because he did not hold the deed to the property, the lending firm required the signature of the legal trustee to authorize the lien. I stared at the bottom of the final page. There, rendered in shaky but deliberate blue ink, was my own name. My father had forged my signature. He committed a severe felony to pay off the gambling debts of his golden boy, utilizing my property as his shield. The Dallas elites were about to witness a catastrophic downfall. The Silver Magnolia Charity Gala defined the apex of the Dallas social season. The country club ballroom had been transformed into a breathtaking sanctuary of wealth and privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of influential guests, draped in designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. My botanical design firm served as the lead sponsor for the evening. I spent the entire afternoon weaving intricate overhead installations featuring cascading white wisteria, lush green eucalyptus, and delicate orchids. The scent of fresh blooms filled the cavernous space. It was a visual masterpiece, cementing my reputation among the city elite. Yet, beneath the veneer of high society elegance, a quiet storm brewed in my chest. Inside Ethan's tailored jacket pocket rested the counterfeit loan application. My father had crossed from toxic parenting into felony fraud, using my name as collateral to save his own skin. I stood near a towering arrangement of hydrangeas, holding a glass of sparkling water, waiting for the trap to spring. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom swung open, admitting Richard and Diane Shepard. They glided into the room, playing the role of the flawless united couple. My father wore a sharp midnight blue tuxedo, his posture straight, projecting the image of a successful patriarch. He shook hands with bank executives and nodded to real estate moguls, entirely unaware that the predatory lending firm had forwarded his forged application directly to my office. My mother floated beside him in an emerald silk dress, wearing diamonds that likely belonged to a consignment shop. She smiled radiantly, greeting her fellow socialites with air kisses and practiced laughter. They believed their facade remained intact. They believed the fabricated hospital visit was a minor setback, and this gala would provide the ultimate leverage to force my surrender. The Dallas elite operated on a strict currency of reputation. Diane intended to weaponize that currency tonight, utilizing the fear of public scandal to extract my signature on a new property deed. The cocktail hour reached its peak, a hum of polite conversation and clinking crystal glasses echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Ethan stood a few feet away, engaged in a discussion with a local investor, but his eyes never drifted far from my location. I watched Diane navigate the crowded floor. She moved with deliberate precision, flanked by 3 prominent members of the country club board. These women were the arbiters of local gossip, the wives of senators and hedge fund managers. Diane was bringing her audience. She cornered me near a towering pyramid of champagne flutes, ensuring we were surrounded by influential ears. "Bridget, darling," Diane cooed, her voice carrying a distinct theatrical sorrow. "It has been agonizing trying to reach you." She stepped uncomfortably close, invading my personal space. Her socialite friends offered sympathetic, pitying glances. Diane leaned forward, initiating her loud whisper. It was a calculated volume, designed to sound like a private conversation, while ensuring everyone within a 10-foot radius caught every single word. "I know you are angry about the inheritance," Diane murmured, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "But punishing your own flesh and blood is going too far. You are trying to make your father and me homeless. We raised you. We provided everything for you. Holding that house hostage out of pure greed is tearing this family apart." The surrounding conversation dulled. The women flanking my mother leaned in, their eyes wide, absorbing the scandalous narrative. Diane was painting me as a ruthless, ungrateful child, destroying her loving parents over a trust fund. She reached into her metallic clutch purse and extracted a folded document printed on heavy legal paper. "This is a compromise agreement," Diane stated, holding out a sleek silver pen. "It simply transfers the Highland Park deed back into our names and waives the back rent. It protects our dignity. Sign it right now, Bridget. Put an end to this ugly behavior before everyone in this room learns what kind of daughter you really are." She expected me to shrink. She anticipated the crushing weight of public scrutiny would force me to grab the pen and sign away my grandfather's legacy just to escape the judging stares of her friends. For 30 years, that tactic worked. I spent my life making myself small to accommodate their inflated egos. But the woman standing by the champagne tower was no longer the girl they could intimidate. I did not reach for the pen. I kept my hands resting calmly at my sides. Ethan materialized next to me, his presence solid and unwavering. He did not say a word to my mother or her wide-eyed audience. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out the manila folder containing the loan application, and slid it smoothly across the small cocktail table sitting between us. Richard noticed the commotion and strode over to intercept his face, arranged in a stern, paternal frown. "Is there a problem here?" he demanded, hoping to command the narrative. Ethan tapped the top sheet of paper. "Your signature is the problem, Richard." My father looked down. His eyes locked onto the header of the predatory lending firm. He saw the forged ink at the bottom of the page. The arrogant flush drained from his face in an instant, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His jaw slackened. The polished patriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified man staring at the physical evidence of his own crime. He knew Ethan possessed the financial expertise to recognize fraud, and he knew a felony conviction would strip away his freedom, let alone his social standing. Diane, blind to the contents of the folder, doubled down on her performance. She grabbed her husband's arm, assuming his silence was a reaction to my defiance. "Do not ignore us, Bridget," she hissed, her voice rising above the polite chatter of the room. "If you do not sign this compromise right now, I will walk over to that microphone and tell every single person in this club how you manipulated a dying man. I will ruin your business. I will ruin your reputation. You will have nothing." The threat hung in the air, heavy and venomous. Her friends gasped, sensing an impending societal explosion. Richard tried to pull Diane away, his hands shaking, but she shook him off, her eyes blazing with desperate fury. She thought she held the ultimate trump card. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my character. I looked at the woman who abandoned my wedding vows, and I felt the final thread of obligation snap. She wanted a public spectacle. I decided to give her one. I simply turned my back on her and gestured toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. I was the lead sponsor. I was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. I walked through the parting crowd, my heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor. I ascended the short stairs to the stage, the rustle of my silk dress echoing in my own ears. I stepped behind the acrylic podium and looked out over the sea of upturned faces. Richard and Diane stood frozen near the champagne tower, realizing they no longer controlled the narrative. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic thump resonated through the grand ballroom. The polite conversation ceased. Hundreds of eyes locked onto me. The room fell into a breathless, expectant silence. I looked toward the back of the hall, found the technician operating the lighting board, and offered a single, deliberate nod. I signaled the audio-visual team to cut the main lights. The crystal chandeliers suspended above the grand ballroom faded into pitch blackness. A single stark spotlight illuminated the clear acrylic podium at the edge of the stage. I gripped the smooth edges of the stand. Hundreds of faces stared back at me from the dark, their expressions hidden in the shadows of the expansive room. The silence was profound, heavy with the expectation of a polite keynote address meant to celebrate philanthropy and botanical art. I leaned closer to the microphone. My voice echoed through the vast space, steady and clear. Authenticity is the foundation of everything I create. I began letting the words settle over the Dallas elite. I cannot arrange blooming jasmine or delicate orchids over a root system suffering from decay. The soil must be healthy, or the entire structure will eventually wither and collapse. For 30 years, I was taught to cover up the decay in my own foundation. I was instructed to smile, to weave beautiful floral arrangements, and to pretend the earth beneath my feet was not poisoned. But true art requires honesty. Tonight, I cannot stand before you as a sponsor and speak about growth while hiding the truth of how I arrived on this stage. I took a slow breath and stepped slightly away from the center of the podium. I am a designer, I continued, my voice resonating over the quiet crowd. I communicate through imagery. Please direct your attention to the screens. The towering digital displays flanking the stage flickered to life. The high-definition screens illuminated the dark room with a hauntingly beautiful, deeply tragic visual. It was a crisp, sweeping video shot of the Trinity Limestone Chapel from the afternoon of my wedding. The camera slowly panned down the empty center aisle, coming to rest on the front row. The two vintage wooden chairs filled the glowing screens. They were wrapped in thick, suffocating, thorny briar vines, while a solitary white orchid struggled to bloom between the harsh branches. The visual was stark, undeniable, and heartbreaking. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the seated guests. Then the audio track initiated. It was not a musical score. It was a voice recognized by every influential developer, politician, and banker sitting in the room. It was the distinct, commanding baritone of Harrison Shepherd. If you are watching this, my father-in-law spoke from beyond the grave. His voice filled the ballroom, rich and unwavering. People believed I sat in my estate, isolated from reality. But silence is the greatest tool for gathering the truth. The screens shifted from the thorny chairs to grainy black and white security footage dated 10 years ago. The crowd watched as a younger Richard Shepard stood behind a heavy oak desk, forging a signature on a bank ledger. Watch him drain his daughter's education fund to cover a failed stock trade, Grandpa narrated, exposing the exact mechanism of my stolen college tuition. Watch him force Bridget to work night shifts at a floral market to survive while he funds a lavish illusion for himself. The murmurs in the ballroom ceased entirely. The atmosphere turned into a vacuum. The wealthy socialites, the wives of state senators, and the country club board members who had flanked Diane just moments earlier now stared at the screens in frozen horror. I looked down at the floor near the champagne tower. My mother stood paralyzed. Her hands covered her mouth, and the emerald silk dress suddenly looked like a stolen costume. My father looked like the floor had vanished beneath his feet. He took a staggering step backward, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an exit that felt miles away. The video faded back to the haunting image of the overgrown chairs. I stepped back up to the microphone. My grandfather left me his entire estate because he saw the truth I stated, ensuring every syllable carried the weight of my endurance. He drafted a will that required my parents to attend my wedding to secure their inheritance. They chose to skip their only daughter's vows to watch a collegiate soccer game from the bleachers. The empty vine-covered chairs you see on the screen were their reserved seats. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the stage monitors. But the betrayal did not end with their absence, I continued. When they realized their choice cost them their wealth, they attempted to destroy me. They hired a litigator to sue me for undue influence, claiming my grandfather lacked mental capacity. When the video diaries neutralized their lawsuit, they tried to stage a fake medical emergency to pass a moral test designated by the estate. And yesterday, when the loan sharks tracking my brother's gambling debts began circling their home, Richard Shepard crossed a fatal line. I looked directly at my father, pinning him under the spotlight of his own actions. He submitted a high-interest loan application utilizing the Highland Park estate as collateral. He forged my signature to authorize the lien. He committed a severe felony to maintain a social facade. I am standing here tonight because I refuse to be the collateral damage of their narcissism any longer. I refuse to let them weaponize public perception against me. The truth is now on the table. In the front row, seated at a premium table draped in white linen, sat Arthur Pendleton. He was the president of the largest commercial bank in Texas and the exact man Richard had been courting for a lifeline loan over the past 3 months. Arthur had listened to my father's pitches, entertained his golf invitations, and considered extending a generous line of credit to save the Shepard family from ruin. Arthur stared at the frozen image of the forged ledger on the screen. He did not say a single word. He simply set his crystal tumbler of scotch down on the table. He stood up, adjusted the lapels of his tailored tuxedo jacket, and turned his back on the stage. Arthur walked straight past Richard, ignoring my father's desperate reaching hand. The social ruin was instantaneous. Without Arthur Pendleton, Richard had zero financial future in Dallas. The other executives in the room watched the departure and silently followed suit, turning their chairs slightly away from my parents. The domino effect had begun, and the ostracization was undeniable. I gripped the podium one last time. Self-respect is the quietest form of revenge, I concluded. I do not need to seek vengeance. I only needed to stop protecting your secrets. Thank you for your time, and please enjoy the rest of the evening. I stepped away from the microphone. For 10 agonizing seconds, the ballroom remained submerged in a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer magnitude of the exposure paralyzed the crowd. Then, from the shadows near the rear exit, someone began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Ethan stood near the doors, his hands coming together in a steady rhythm. Maya stood beside him, joining in with fierce pride. Slowly, the applause spread. It rippled through the front tables, gaining momentum and volume until the entire ballroom erupted into roaring approval. It was not polite golf clapping. It was the fierce, resounding endorsement of people who respected spine over status. The Dallas elite, infamous for preserving polite fictions, chose to applaud the shattering of one. The lights in the ballroom slowly faded back up to a warm golden glow. The illusion was permanently broken. The guests turned their collective gaze toward the champagne tower to witness the fallout. But the space where Richard and Diane stood was empty. They had dropped their crystal glasses, abandoning their dignity and their remaining social currency on the hardwood floor. They fled the country club through a side service door, sprinting toward the valet stand in total disgrace. They were bankrupt in every conceivable metric. They possessed zero money, zero property, and now zero reputation. I walked down the stage stairs, finding Ethan waiting at the bottom. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a fierce embrace. The adrenaline was slowly leaving my system, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. The war of public perception was over, and the heavy burden I had carried for a decade was finally lifted. As we walked out of the country club into the warm Texas night, my phone vibrated in my clutch purse. The 6-month deadline of the repentance clause had officially expired at midnight. The estate belonged permanently to me. However, a shattered family does not simply vanish into the night. Driven out of their social circles and facing immediate financial ruin, the cornered predators had to turn their anger somewhere, and the only target left was the golden boy who had triggered their collapse in the first place. The digital clock resting on my nightstand shifted from 11:59 to midnight. A quiet electronic click echoed in the dark bedroom. That singular minute marked the official expiration of the repentance clause. The 6-month probationary window designed by my grandfather closed forever. Richard and Diane had failed the moral test in every conceivable metric. The entire $8.5 million estate, including the Highland Park property and all liquid assets, transferred permanently and irrevocably into my sole control. The invisible tether connecting me to their toxic demands dissolved into the night air. I exhaled a breath I felt I had been holding for 10 years. The fallout from the charity gala descended upon my parents with brutal efficiency. The Dallas elite do not tolerate public embarrassment. They operate on a strict code of reputation, and my father had violated that code by committing forgery. By Monday morning, the financial isolation was swift and undeniable. Richard stopped at a premium fueling station to fill his luxury sedan. He swiped his sleek metallic credit card. The digital screen flashed a bright red, declined notification. He retrieved a second card, then a third. Every single account was frozen. The banks had reviewed the forged loan application and severed all ties, flagging his profile for potential fraudulent activity. He drove away on an empty tank, his financial power erased. Diane faced her own unique brand of societal execution. She sat in the breakfast nook of the Highland Park mansion, wearing her silk robe, checking her messages. An email arrived from the board of directors at the country club. The message contained only 3 terse sentences. It informed her that her membership privileges were revoked effective immediately, citing a severe breach of community standards. There was no phone call. There was no offer to appeal the decision. Her friends, the wealthy socialites she had desperately tried to impress, blocked her number. She was excommunicated from the only world that gave her life meaning. The external pressures squeezed the Shepherd household into a suffocating box. With the estate lost, the banks circling, and the eviction notice counting down the final days, the toxic family unit turned inward. Predators backed into a corner will always cannibalize their own. Richard and Diane needed a scapegoat. They could no longer reach me, so they aimed their resentment at the only target left inside the house. Chase was sitting at the vast marble kitchen island. He looked hollow, staring blankly into a bowl of untouched cereal. He had slinked back to the mansion because his friends had stopped returning his calls once his wallet ran empty. Richard marched into the kitchen, tossing a stack of past-due utility bills onto the pristine countertop.
"You are going to have to pull your weight,"
Richard snapped, his voice tight with desperation. "I cannot fund your lazy lifestyle anymore. You need to drive down to the hardware store or the local grocery market and secure a position today. We need cash flow, Chase. You are going to work a register until we figure out how to salvage this mess." Chase slowly lowered his spoon. He looked up at the man who had spent the last decade grooming him to be a sports star, exempt from chores, exempt from consequences, and exempt from reality. Diane walked into the room, folding her arms across her chest, nodding in agreement with her husband. "You have to step up," Diane added, her tone laced with bitter accusation. "Your sister stole our future. We sacrificed everything to give you the best training, the best camps, the best life. It is your turn to repay that investment." The word investment triggered a physical reaction. Chase stood up. The wooden bar stool scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The conditioning of the obedient golden boy fractured and broke apart right there in the kitchen. "You did not invest in me," Chase yelled, his voice cracking with years of suppressed agony. "You invested in yourselves. You used me as a prop so you could brag to your friends at the club. You never cared if I was happy. You only cared if I scored goals so you could wear the right team colors in the VIP section." Richard stepped forward, his face flushed red with anger. "Do not raise your voice to your mother. We gave you everything." "You gave me a cage," Chase fired back, refusing to back down. "I hate soccer. I hated every single second I spent on that field. I begged you to let me quit in high school, but you told me I would be a failure if I stopped playing. So I found a way to fail on purpose." Diane gasped, stepping back as if she had been physically struck. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "I sabotaged my own career." Chase confessed the truth, pouring out of him in a relentless flood. "I got myself benched. I placed illegal bets against my own team just to ensure the coach would cut me. I owe underground bookies $40,000, and they are the ones leaving threatening notes on the driveway. Bridget did not ruin this family. I ruined it because I could not breathe under your expectations anymore. You treated me like a show pony instead of a son." The silence that followed was deafening. The illusion of the perfect Shepherd family shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces on the kitchen floor. Richard stared at his son, his mouth open, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the deception. Diane covered her face with her hands, finally realizing the extent of the damage their narcissism had caused. Chase did not wait for their response. He turned around, walked upstairs, and packed a single canvas duffel bag. He left his designer clothes and expensive watches behind. He walked out the front door of the Highland Park mansion, leaving his parents alone in an echoing, empty house they no longer owned. While their foundation crumbled, I was busy building a new one. I sat at the drafting table in my botanical studio, sunlight streaming through the large industrial windows. Maya stood beside me, holding a warm cup of coffee, reviewing a set of architectural blueprints spread across the wooden desk. We were designing a massive, state-of-the-art greenhouse to be constructed on the rear grounds of the Highland Park estate. The structure featured high, vaulted glass ceilings, automated climate controls, and dedicated zones for rare orchid cultivation. It was a project my grandfather had dreamed of building before his health declined. I was bringing his vision to life. "You should widen the eastern doors," Maya suggested, tracing a line on the blueprint with her pen. "You will need the clearance to bring in the large citrus trees during the winter months." I smiled, making the adjustment on the paper. Maya was not just my sister-in-law. She was a pillar of the family I had chosen. She offered support without demanding a receipt. We spent the afternoon discussing irrigation systems and soil compositions focused entirely on growth and renewal. The contrast between my peaceful studio and the imploding mansion across town was profound. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by the studio. He handed me a sealed envelope from Thomas Sterling. I opened the flap and reviewed the certified bank receipt inside. I had made a very quiet, calculated decision regarding my brother. Chase had hit rock bottom. He was wandering the city with a target on his back, hunted by men who did not care about his emotional revelations. I knew that leaving him to face those loan sharks alone could result in severe physical harm. But I also knew that handing him a check directly would only foster a new dependency. I instructed Mr. Sterling to utilize a blind corporate entity to wire $40,000 directly to the bookies. The transaction was untraceable. The debt was cleared instantly, erasing the threat without providing Chase an opportunity to ask for more. I found out Chase was staying at a cheap roadside motel on the edge of the city limits. I did not visit him. I did not want a tearful reunion or a promise of future repayment. I simply hired a courier to deliver a plain white envelope to the motel front desk. Inside the envelope was the finalized debt clearance receipt and a short, handwritten note. The note contained only 2 sentences. "You are free. Now build your own life." I saved my brother from the immediate danger he created, but I cleanly severed the cord of reliance. He had a zero balance and a blank slate. Whether he chose to learn from the hard soil or repeat his mistakes was entirely up to him. I closed the ledger on Chase Shepard. The end of the month arrived with the relentless certainty of a ticking clock. The 30-day eviction notice mandated by Texas law reached its final hour. Richard and Diane had exhausted every delay tactic. They possessed no legal recourse, no financial lifeline, and no social connections willing to offer them shelter. The reality they had fought so hard to deny was standing on their doorstep. I parked my car down the street from the Highland Park estate, sitting quietly in the driver's seat with the engine turned off. The morning air was crisp. I watched through the windshield as the rumble of a heavy diesel engine broke the quiet neighborhood peace. A large, battered moving truck turned onto the pristine street. The air brakes hissed loudly as the driver pulled the vehicle right up to the grand wrought iron gates of the mansion. The morning sun baked the pristine white gravel of the Highland Park circular driveway. Heat radiated upward, distorting the air around the idling engine of a rented discount moving truck. The heavy stench of diesel exhaust choked the usually fragrant breeze that drifted through the neighborhood azaleas. I sat perfectly still in the plush leather back seat of my town car, parked just beyond the wrought iron gates. I watched the final grueling hours of the 30-day eviction notice tick away. Richard and Diane Shepard were hauling their ruined lives out of the grand foyer in cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes. They could not afford a professional moving service. The frozen banking accounts and public disgrace meant they had to rely on their own aching muscles to pack up their failures. My father descended the sweeping stone steps. He wore a faded, sweat-stained polo shirt that clung to his back. His face was flushed red from exertion, his breathing shallow and labored. The bespoke suits and tailored Italian wool that once defined his arrogant patriarch persona were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of manual labor. He dropped a heavy box onto the driveway. The cardboard buckled, tearing open at one corner to reveal a chaotic jumble of kitchen utensils and plastic picture frames. Diane emerged a moment later. She was dragging a black plastic garbage bag across the marble porch. She had sold her designer leather luggage weeks ago to cover basic utility bills. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands around her face, devoid of the meticulous salon styling she once used as armor. They were packing for a dismal 2-bedroom apartment in a forgotten, undesirable suburb, and the sheer humiliation of the transition was etched deeply into their exhausted postures. "Drive through the gates," I told Ethan, keeping my voice low and steady. Ethan shifted the town car into gear. The heavy tires crossed the threshold of the estate, crunching loudly against the pristine gravel. The sound shattered the quiet morning, echoing against the towering marble columns of the mansion. Richard froze halfway down the steps. He dropped a second box, the impact echoing like a gunshot. Diane stopped dead in her tracks, her hands releasing the black plastic bag. I opened the rear passenger door and stepped out into the humid Texas morning. Ethan and Maya exited the vehicle simultaneously, moving to flank me. We stood shoulder to shoulder on the driveway. We formed an impenetrable wall of chosen family, facing the broken remnants of a biological one. The sight of the town car acted like a sudden jolt of electricity to my parents. The arrogant defiance that fueled their courtroom threats and gala ambushes had vanished. The looming reality of an impoverished life in a cramped suburban apartment stripped away their final layers of pride. Diane left her garbage bag on the porch. She rushed across the gravel, her feet stumbling in her haste to reach me.
Bridget, please, Diane sobbed, her voice cracking with raw, uncalculated panic.
Please do not do this. You have made your point. You won. There were no theatrical tears this time. There was no calculated pitch meant to sway country club socialites. Her desperation was visceral and genuine. She reached out her hands, shaking, hovering just inches from my arm, terrified to actually touch me.
We cannot live in that tiny apartment, Diane pleaded, her chest heaving as she struggled for breath.
It is in a terrible neighborhood. The walls are paper thin. People will see us. Just give us a fraction of the estate. Just enough for a down payment on a small condominium in a respectable zip code. You have millions of dollars. You will not even miss a tiny sliver. You cannot throw your own mother into the gutter.
Richard walked slowly down the remaining steps, leaving his dropped boxes behind.
He stopped a few feet away from us. He looked decades older, a hollow shell of the man who used to dictate my worth. He swallowed hard, staring at the polished toes of Ethan's shoes, before forcing himself to look me in the eye.
I failed, Richard admitted, his voice a low, gravelly whisper.
I made terrible choices. I lied, but we have lost everything. We lost our friends, our credit, our son. I am asking you for a fresh start, just a small loan, a bridge to get us back on our feet. I will sign whatever you want. I will pay you back with interest. Just show a little mercy.
I stood firm, feeling the solid presence of Maya and Ethan radiating support on either side of me.
I looked at the man and woman pleading for financial mercy. My mind drifted back to the limestone chapel. I thought about the empty wooden chairs covered in thorny vines. I remembered the short voicemail where they chose a collegiate soccer game over witnessing my vows. I remembered the stolen college tuition, the forged loan application, and the relentless attempts to invalidate my grandfather's sanity. They were begging for a fresh start, but they were only asking for currency. They still believed money could fix the rot in our foundation. They wanted an easy escape from the consequences they had meticulously engineered. Self-respect is the quietest form of revenge, I stated softly, letting the words settle into the humid morning air. I do not need to watch you suffer in a rundown suburban apartment to prove my worth. I do not need to banish you from this city to feel powerful.
Diane let out a sharp gasp of relief, interpreting my words as a sudden surrender.
Oh, thank you, Bridget. Thank you. I knew you had a forgiving heart. She reached forward to embrace me, but Maya stepped smoothly into her path, holding up a single manicured hand to halt the movement. Diane stopped abruptly, confusion washing over her tear-stained face.
I am not evicting you from the estate grounds, I clarified, keeping my tone strictly professional.
But I am not giving you a single dollar of my grandfather's wealth. Nor am I offering you a loan for a new condominium. You are not receiving a financial payout. Richard frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Then how are we supposed to survive?
I turned to Maya.
She unzipped the sleek leather folio she carried and withdrew a crisp, dense stack of legal documents. She handed the papers directly to my father. He took them tentatively, his eyes scanning the bold heading printed at the top of the first page. It was a binding employment contract. This property spans 4 acres of manicured gardens, azalea beds, and rare botanical features, I explained, gesturing toward the sprawling grounds surrounding the mansion. I am expanding my floral design business. We are currently breaking ground on an expansive commercial greenhouse behind the main house. The scope of this property requires constant, grueling daily maintenance. I need full-time groundskeepers. Richard stared at the contract, his mouth opening and closing in silent shock. You want us to work for you? I want you to earn your shelter, I corrected him. You will not be living in the main house. You will surrender your keys to the front door today. At the far rear of the property, hidden behind the old oak trees, sits the original carriage house. Diane let out a horrified whimpering sound. The carriage house was a small, outdated structure built a century ago. It was roughly the size of a single garage, utilized primarily to store old lawnmowers, rusted tools, and forgotten patio furniture. It possessed basic plumbing, a tiny kitchenette, and a single cramped bedroom. Crucially, it lacked central air conditioning, a brutal reality during the relentless, sweltering Texas summers. You will live in the servant quarters, I continued, my voice unwavering. Your rent will be deducted directly from your weekly wages. Your responsibilities will include pulling weeds, laying fresh mulch, trimming the hedges, and maintaining the soil health for my botanical inventory. You will report directly to Ethan, who acts as the financial manager for the estate. If you miss a shift, your pay will be docked. If you attempt to enter the main house without explicit invitation, you will be terminated. If you quit, this contract is voided immediately, and you will be escorted off the property by law enforcement. My parents stood paralyzed in the gravel driveway. The choice in front of them was a devastating psychological trap. They could reject the contract, retain a tiny shred of their pride, and face the bleak, impoverished reality of the suburban apartment they were currently packing for. Or they could accept the offer, remain on the prestigious Highland Park estate, but do so as manual laborers, serving the daughter they had treated like dirt. It was the ultimate, inescapable reversal of their fates. They had spent their entire lives obsessed with appearances and high society status. Now they were offered the chance to stay in the wealthiest zip code in Texas, but the price was their dignity. Diane looked at the grand marble columns of the mansion, then at the small, distant roof of the carriage house, barely visible through the thick tree branches. She looked at the moving truck, visualizing the dismal life awaiting them outside these iron gates. Her shoulders slumped. The fight left her. She nodded, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She was willing to become a servant, just to keep a Highland Park address. Richard gripped the employment contract, his knuckles turning white. He swallowed his pride, a bitter, agonizing process that seemed to age him 10 years in a matter of seconds. He pulled a cheap pen from his pocket, signed the bottom of the page with a shaking hand, and handed the document back to Maya. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat. I withdrew an item I had purchased at the local hardware store early this morning. I stepped forward and held the object out toward my father. It was a pair of thick, heavy-duty canvas gardening gloves. They were stiff, unyielding, and coated in a thin layer of protective rubber, meant for pulling thorns and digging in hard clay. Richard stared down at the gloves, unable to raise his hands to accept them. His eyes were wide with a horrifying realization of the life he had just agreed to live. You always wanted a beautiful garden, I told them, dropping the heavy canvas gloves onto the pristine white gravel at their feet. Now you have to earn it. I turned my back on them and walked toward the open door of the town car. Ethan and Maya followed closely behind, their steps synchronized and purposeful. We did not look back as we climbed into the plush leather seats. Ethan shifted the car into drive, steering us smoothly toward the main house to begin our new life. I glanced in the side mirror one last time. Richard and Diane Shepherd were standing alone in the driveway, staring in horror at the dirty gardening gloves resting in the dirt, finally understanding the true cost of their betrayal. Summer arrived in Texas with a brutal, suffocating heat. August in Dallas is not a season you merely endure. It is a physical weight that presses down on your shoulders the moment you step outside.
The sun baked the earth, turning the rich soil of the Highland Park estate into hard, unyielding clay. 6 months had passed since the morning the moving truck idled in the driveway. The new reality had settled over the property, casting a long, poetic shadow over the manicured lawns. Richard Shepard, the former banking executive and country club fixture, pushed a rusted metal wheelbarrow across the expansive backyard. The cart was loaded with 50-pound bags of dark cedar mulch. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and soaking the collar of a cheap gray shirt. His hands, once soft and accustomed to holding crystal Scotch glasses, were blistered and heavily calloused. He strained against the wooden handles, his breathing harsh and ragged as he navigated the uneven terrain toward the sprawling rose garden. A few yards away, Diane knelt in the dirt. She wore an oversized straw hat and faded denim jeans stained with mud. She was using a small metal trowel to dig out stubborn crabgrass from the roots. Her posture was stooped. The woman who once spent her afternoons browsing luxury boutiques now spent her days fighting weeds under a scorching sun. The physical labor was only half of their punishment. The true agony lay in the geographic location of their servitude. The wrought iron gates of the estate offered a clear view of the street. Word of their downfall had spread through the high society circles like a wildfire. Former friends and rival socialites did not offer sympathy. They offered spectacle. Luxury sedans and imported sports cars frequently slowed down as they passed the property. The tinted windows would roll down just enough for the occupants to gawk at the fallen elite working in the dirt. Diane heard the low purr of an engine slowing near the curb. She glanced over her shoulder and spotted a familiar silver convertible. It belonged to the president of the charity board she used to chair. The woman inside raised a pair of designer sunglasses, staring openly at Diane kneeling in the soil. A hot flush of deep, searing humiliation crept up my mother's neck. She dropped her trowel and stood up, desperate to hide her face under the brim of her hat. She turned her back to the street, rubbing her aching lower spine with a trembling hand. She hobbled toward the shade of a large magnolia tree, seeking refuge from the judging eyes and the blistering heat. She had barely reached the cool shadow of the branches when footsteps approached along the stone pathway. Ethan walked toward her, holding a digital tablet. He wore a crisp linen shirt and tailored trousers, looking every bit the professional financial manager he was. He did not carry a whip or raise his voice. He wielded something far more intimidating. He wielded accountability. You are assigned to the western flower beds until 4 o'clock. Diane. Ethan stated, his tone polite but entirely devoid of warmth. Diane let out a sharp, dramatic sigh, leaning heavily against the trunk of the magnolia. My back is in agony, Ethan. The heat is unbearable today. I just need a 15-minute rest in the shade. I am not a machine. Ethan looked down at the tablet screen, tapping a stylus against the glass. You are an employee of this botanical enterprise, he corrected her. Your contract stipulates 2 15-minute breaks per shift, which you have already exhausted. You are currently taking an unapproved pause in productivity. She glared at him, a flicker of her old entitlement surfacing. I am her mother. You cannot treat me like a common day laborer. I manage the payroll for the groundskeeping staff, Ethan replied, ignoring her attempt to invoke a family hierarchy that no longer existed. Since you are refusing to return to your designated zone, I am docking your hourly wage for the remainder of this hour. The deduction will be reflected in your Friday envelope. If you prefer to end your shift early, you can return to the carriage house, and I will deduct the full afternoon. The threat of losing her meager wages instantly extinguished her defiance. She needed every dollar to cover the rent deducted for that sweltering, unair-conditioned carriage house. Diane swallowed her pride, picked up her metal trowel, and limped back out into the punishing sunlight to finish pulling the weeds. Ethan recorded the interaction on his tablet and walked back toward the main house, enforcing the boundaries with flawless precision. While my parents paid the agonizing price for their deception, a different kind of story was unfolding 3 hours south. Chase had settled in Austin. The golden boy who once gambled away $40,000 while pretending to be a star athlete was learning how to live in the real world. He rented a small, basic studio apartment above a bustling diner. He secured a position as an assistant manager at a local hardware store. He spent his days organizing inventory, assisting customers, and sweeping the concrete floors. He did not own a luxury vehicle or wear imported sneakers. He rode a second-hand bicycle to work. But for the first time in his life, the sweat on his brow was earned, not manufactured for an audience. He was slowly stripping away the toxic expectations our parents had woven into his identity. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I looked at the screen and saw a new text message from Chase. It was a photograph of a small potted cactus sitting on a laminated employee breakroom table. The caption read, "It is not much, but I managed to keep this one alive for a whole month. Miss you, Bridge." It was a simple, quiet gesture. There were no requests for cash. There were no dramatic apologies or promises of grand redemption. It was just a small, genuine step toward healing. I typed a quick reply, telling him I was proud of his progress. I saved my brother by cutting the cord, allowing him to find his own roots away from the poisoned soil of our family tree. Back in Dallas, the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden hue over the estate. I walked out onto the second-story balcony of the main house. The view overlooked the expansive rear gardens, where my new commercial greenhouse was nearing completion. The glass panels gleamed in the fading light, a testament to growth and endurance. Down below, near the base of a towering century-old oak tree, Diane was preparing a new bed for a rare species of climbing orchids. She was using a small hand rake to clear away decades of accumulated debris and old roots. The earth here was dense and stubborn. She plunged the metal tines into the soil and pulled backward. The rake caught on something buried just beneath the surface. Diane paused, wiping a streak of dirt from her forehead. She dug her fingers into the dark earth to retrieve the obstruction. She pulled out a small rectangular object covered in a thick layer of mud. She used her dirty thumb to wipe the grime away, revealing a piece of clear, heavy-duty lamination. I watched from the balcony as her shoulders stiffened. Even from a distance, I could see the exact moment the realization struck her. She held the object up to catch the fading sunlight. Inside the protective plastic rested a tiny, preserved yellow daisy. It was the exact pressed flower I had given to my grandfather when I was 7 years old. The flower he had saved in his pocket while she scolded me for ruining my pristine dress. After the wedding, I had laminated the delicate bloom and buried it near the roots of the oldest oak tree on the property, returning his message of love back to the earth he cherished. Diane stared at the preserved daisy. Her hands began to shake. The heavy, crushing weight of her life choices condensed into that singular, quiet moment. She held the physical proof of a pure, unconditional love she had deemed worthless. She realized that the old man she called senile had seen the beauty in a muddy child, while she had spent her life chasing empty reflections in country club mirrors. She fell to her knees in the dirt. She did not scream or put on a dramatic performance. She just bowed her head, clutching the laminated flower to her chest, her body trembling with genuine, silent grief. She finally understood the magnitude of what she had thrown away, and she knew she could never buy it back. I stood on the balcony, leaning my hands against the cool stone railing. A gentle evening breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree. I looked down at the woman weeping in the soil, and I looked across the yard at the man hauling bags of mulch until his hands bled. I did not feel a rush of dark vengeance. I did not feel a surge of arrogant triumph. Those emotions belong to people who are still fighting a war. My war was over. I felt the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart. I felt the warmth of the fading sun on my skin. I felt the profound, unshakable certainty that my foundation was finally secure. I stood on the balcony of the home I owned, watching the gardeners tend to my earth, and I felt nothing but peace. 6 months drifted over the Dallas skyline, bringing the mild, forgiving breeze of a Texas spring. The dust from the legal battles, the public fallout, and the shattered illusions had settled into the earth. I did not keep the Highland Park estate locked behind imposing iron gates. My grandfather's true spirit was never about exclusion or preserving high society status. He built his wealth to create shelter, not to hoard prestige. I honored his legacy by transforming the sprawling front acreage into a thriving community garden. Where my mother once hosted restrictive charity luncheons to show off her wealth, raised cedar planting beds now lined the manicured lawn. Teenagers from local at-risk youth programs spent their afternoons here, learning how to cultivate heirloom tomatoes and resilient wildflowers. I watched them dig their hands into the rich soil, discovering the same quiet healing I found when I was their age. My botanical design firm flourished alongside the garden. The clean, unencumbered capital from the estate allowed me to secure nationwide distribution contracts. We were shipping custom terrariums and elaborate floral installations from New York to Seattle. I was no longer a struggling artist working graveyard shifts at the wholesale market, begging for scraps of affection. I was the architect of my own empire. I stood at the center workbench inside my newly finished commercial greenhouse. The structure was a breathtaking cathedral of glass and steel erected directly behind the main house. The air inside felt heavy with soothing humidity and the rich scent of damp potting soil. Sunlight poured through the transparent ceiling, catching the fine mist from the automated irrigation system and turning it into temporary rainbows across the room. I wore a canvas apron over my clothes, my hands dusted with dark charcoal and organic fertilizer. I was carefully repotting a rare ghost orchid. The roots were delicate, requiring precision and patience to transfer into a larger ceramic vessel. It needed space to stretch, a concept I understood on a deeply personal level. I patted the fresh green moss around the base of the stem, admiring the fragile white petals. The heavy glass door at the end of the greenhouse clicked open. Ethan walked down the center aisle, his leather shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the wet concrete floor. He wore his usual tailored suit trousers, but his dress shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. He was not carrying his financial tablet or any legal folders. His hands were tucked behind his back, and his face bore an expression I had never seen before. It was a mixture of profound awe and radiant, undisguised joy. He stopped at the edge of my workbench. I put down my gardening trowel, wiping my hands on a cotton towel. Before I could ask about his day, Ethan brought his hands forward and placed a small, slender plastic wand onto the wooden table right next to the blooming ghost orchid. I stared at the digital display screen on the wand. 2 bright, undeniable pink lines stared back at me. The air caught in my throat. I looked up at Ethan, my eyes wide, searching his face for confirmation. He nodded, a brilliant smile breaking across his features. "We are going to be parents, Bridget," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached across the table, pulling me into his arms. I buried my face in his shoulder, tears spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. They were not tears of fear or lingering grief. They were the physical release of a generational cycle shattering into dust. For 30 years, I lived under a shadow of conditional affection. I was measured by my utility and discarded when I sought comfort. But as Ethan held me among the thriving orchids, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to the child growing inside me. This baby would never have to buy their place in our home. They would never be forced into a plastic box to serve a social illusion. They would be loved for their roots, their flaws, and their wild, unscripted growth. The toxic legacy of the Shepherd family ended right here in this greenhouse, replaced by a permanent foundation of unconditional support. The greenhouse door opened again, accompanied by a bright, melodic laugh. Maya strolled down the aisle carrying a wicker basket draped with a checkered cloth. She had driven over from her downtown law firm the second Ethan sent her a coded text message.
She pulled a bottle of sparkling apple cider from the basket, along with 3 crystal flutes. "We are celebrating," Maya declared, popping the cork with a festive sound that echoed off the glass walls. She poured the bubbling cider, handing a glass to Ethan and one to me. She raised her flute into the air, the afternoon light catching the golden liquid. "To the new roots," Maya toasted, her eyes shining with fierce pride. "To the family we choose and the family we create." We clinked our glasses together. The sound was bright and clear, ringing with genuine affection. We stood in a circle, laughing and sharing stories about the future. There were no country club photographers documenting the moment. There were no wealthy socialites offering fake pleasantries. It was just the 3 of us, anchored by loyalty and mutual respect. This was my chosen family. They were the people who showed up when the storm hit, and they were the ones standing beside me as the sun broke through the clouds. I took a sip of the sweet cider and turned my gaze toward the expansive glass panels lining the rear wall of the greenhouse. The view offered a sweeping panorama of the estate grounds. Far in the distance, near the edge of the wrought iron perimeter fence, 2 small figures moved slowly through the dense hedges. It was Richard and Diane. They wore matching gray utility uniforms, their heads covered by wide-brimmed hats to shield against the relentless Texas sun. My father pushed a heavy landscaping mower across the grass, his posture hunched and defeated by the physical labor. My mother trailed behind him, dragging a large plastic bin filled with yard clippings and pulled weeds. They were just 2 laborers fading into the background of a sprawling landscape. They looked so small. They looked entirely insignificant. For a decade, those 2 people controlled my self-worth. They possessed the power to crush my spirit with a single phone call. They wielded their approval like a weapon, dictating my joy and enforcing my misery. But looking at them now, separated by a pane of glass and an ocean of healed trauma, I felt no anger. I felt no residual fear. Their ability to hurt me was eradicated. I took a deep breath, inhaling the fragrant scent of the blooming orchids. I reflected on the agonizing journey that brought me to this exact moment. I realized I did not just inherit a fortune from my grandfather. I inherited liberation. I inherited the clarity to distinguish between a bloodline and a lifeline. I thought about the vintage wooden chairs sitting at the front of the limestone chapel on my wedding day. For months, those empty seats symbolized the ultimate rejection. I believed they represented the tragic failure of my family. But standing here, surrounded by the people who truly loved me, the truth finally crystallized. Those empty chairs were not a tragedy. They were an evacuation. They were the universe clearing out the rot to make space for the family I actually deserved. Ethan wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close against his side. Maya launched into a funny story about her latest courtroom victory, her voice animated and full of life. A warm, melodic sound floated up toward the vaulted glass ceiling. It was the sound of our shared laughter. It echoed through the vibrant green foliage, bright and unburdened, filling the sanctuary with the undeniable music of a life beautifully lived.